Huh? Well, not as cool, but his hair's sort of the same colour and he's smiling like you usually do. If you got this suit working, it could be like the mascot of your hangout. Kelsey grinned. That's not bad. He leaned over and took the bear's head in both his hands. Does this come off? He tugged, and the bear's head released from the suit. He looked into the top of the torso and sniffed. Doesn't smell too bad. No worse than the rest of the building. Nope, I noticed that too. He nudged Kelsey and grinned. Try it on. Kelsey studied the suit's neck opening, then shrugged. Why not? He sat down and started wiggling into the torso. Once in, he said, This is pretty comfortable. He grinned. Now the head. Devon had just clipped on the head when Mick shuffled into the room, dragging a stack of plastic bins. No lids. I'm not sure how we're going to be able to take this stuff out. He stopped and stared at the bear on the floor. He looked around. Where's Kelsey? I'm in here, Kelsey called out. Mick's eyes widened. What are... Kelsey sat up and said, I'm not sure how to stand in this thing, but hey, I could whack. He began throwing his arms around in elaborate dance moves. When he threw both arms straight out to his sides, an ear-stabbing metallic clap resounded off of all four walls around them. The clap was followed by a fingernails on a blackboard scraping sound. As abruptly as it started, the scraping sound ended. Scraping sound ended with a loud slap. This triggered a cascade of snapping sounds, like dozens of steel animal traps springing into place one right after the other. Kelsey started shrieking with the first snap. Once, when Devon was little, his mum was driving him to school, and she ran over a cat in the street. The cat didn't die immediately. Instead, it made a sound like all the sounds of suffering rolled into one, screaming, wailing, howling, and other vocals Devon couldn't describe. That sonic signature was embedded in Devon's brain. He'd always thought it would be the worst thing he'd ever hear in his life. He was wrong. This was the worst. And that sound wasn't the bad part. It was bad, yes, but the bad part, the really, really bad part, was the way the suit started jerking in a spastic, horrific dance. It looked like the moth-eaten, mildew-blotched gold bear was convulsing. But it wasn't the bear. Devon knew it wasn't the bear. It was Kelsey. What did I do? Devon thought. What's wrong with him? Mick yelled. Devon jumped. He'd been so mesmerized by Kelsey's suffering that he'd forgotten Mick was there. Kelsey's shriek stopped, like someone or something had severed his vocal cords, and the suit went still. That's when Devon noticed it was turning red. Deep, dark, red. Oh my god. This story is suddenly getting really deep. Is that... Mick pointed. He dropped to his knees. That's blood. Yeah, that was blood. Devon sat back on the floor and pulled his feet tight to his body. The blood saturated the bear's matted fur in seconds and began pooling on the floor. Because the linoleum was blood red, Devon's blood blended with the floor. The only reason Devon could see it was that Kelsey's blood was moving. It had formed in an amobia-like puddle that seemed to be crawling away from the now saturated bear suit. Devon stared at the moving blood. It looked like it was a living thing, a thinking red liquid lake stretching out, seeking. Devon scooted even farther away. He groaned and dropped his head into his hands. This isn't what he meant to do. He'd planned to trap Kelsey in the bear suit and leave him like that for an hour or so to freak him out as payback for what had happened. If he'd thought for a minute that this is what would... He was angry, yes, jealous. Since Friday afternoon, and maybe even before, he'd hated Kelsey more than he'd ever hated anyone or anything. He'd even hated Kelsey more than he hated missing his dad. He'd hated Kelsey just because Kelsey had everything Devon wanted, just when it was looking like he had a chance with Heather. Okay, maybe he'd been deluding himself about that, but still, he wasn't even given the opportunity to find out. Kelsey swept in and made friends with everyone in like 2 seconds. Devon had been trying for his whole life to make one other friend than Mick. Kelsey had no right to have everything come so easily to him. But that didn't mean he deserved this. Dev? Devon brushed at the tears he didn't realize had formed in his eyes. Dev! He wiped his face and looked at Mick. Mick was sitting on the floor, on the opposite side of the bleeding bear suit. Yeah, sure, bleeding bear suit. Devon was still deluding himself. The bear suit wasn't bleeding. Kelsey was. Devon heard Mick hiccup, and he realized Mick was crying. His dirty face was streaked with tears, giving him a strangely tribal look, like he had vertical stripes of war paint on his cheeks. Poor kid, Devon thought. Mick wasn't mature enough to handle something like this. And Devon was? He barked a laugh. Mick's gaze, which had been riveted on the bear's suit and the flowing blood, whipped to Devon. Why are you laughing? His voice was pitched high. Devon shook his head. Never mind. I think I'm in... maybe it's shock. Mick stared at him for a few seconds, and he shifted his attention back to the suit. He flinched. Look at it. It's still moving. He's still alive. We have to get him out there. Devon glanced at the suit. It's kind of pulsed. Like it was a large bloody heart, giving its last beats. Mick repeated, We have to get him out of there. We can't, Devon said. What do you mean? Mick, his mouth hanging open, tears still leaking, his nose running, continued to watch the occasionally trembling suit for... how long? Devon wasn't sure. He didn't feel like he was really there anymore. Obviously, he was, but he wasn't. He was back in the past. He was watching his dad drive away the day he left and never came back. He was watching his tired mother make yet another meal of boxed macaroni and cheese. He was in school watching all the other kids laugh and joke with one another. He was hanging out with Mick in their gas station clubhouse. He was watching Heather, wishing she would notice him. He was realizing the moment when she said his name. He was listening to her talk about justice in social studies class. He could see her, in her red sweater, and he could just hear her tingling voice. I think justice is payback. Payback. That was all he'd intended to do. He'd wanted justice. Payback. Kelsey had hurt him. He'd made Devon feel like he might be a part of something, and then he'd thrown Devon away. It stung, like being stabbed with a sharp object. He just wanted Kelsey to feel something similar, and maybe he'd wanted Kelsey to end up scarred, like Devon was scarred by every rejection he'd endured. But he hadn't wanted this. Not this. Accidents happen, Heather thrilled in his mind. Devon yelped when Mick shook his shoulder. How did Mick get over here? Devon frowned and shook his cobweb-filled head. Why aren't you answering me? I keep asking what you mean. What do you mean we can't get him out? Mick was close. Too close. Devon could see snot drying under Mick's nose. I mean, we can't because... Devon moaned. Mick studied him for a few seconds. Then he slowly scooted away from Devon. Did you do this on purpose? Devon didn't answer him. Did you? Devon tried to moisten his mouth enough to swallow. Did you murder him? Mick screamed. No! Devon shot up off the floor and started pacing back and forth. Suddenly tears poured from his eyes and he couldn't stop them. No! But what just happened? Mick hugged his knees and rocked himself. Devon stared at the bloody suit. He rubbed his face. I wanted to get back at him. By killing him? Mick scrambled to his feet. No! Then what? When I was here before, I found the suit, and I tried to put the arm on. His words distorted like... His words distorted his sobs. Sobs! He knew. He could see Mick concentrating, trying to understand him. The suit has these locking things inside. Once you snap it in place, it's almost impossible to get off by yourself. Devon tapped the gauze on the back of his hand, where he'd torn off some skin, escaping the suit's heavy arm. So you knew what would happen? No. I mean, yes. No, but no. I mean, I only wanted to scare him. I figured once he was locked in, we'd leave him in this place until sundown, just to make him sweat a bit. I wanted him to feel something unfair, like what he did to us. Like what I felt when he and his neighbour drove away with... I wanted him to be hurt. I didn't want him to actually get hurt, though. Not like that. The golden suit shuddered, and Kelsey let out a gurgle. He's still alive, Mick whispered. He started towards the suit, but Devon grabbed his arm. Don't touch it! Mick broke free, stared at Devon for a second, then he ran toward the building entrance. We have to get help! Devon ran after him, and grabbed his arm again. We can't do that! What? Why? We'll go to jail! You'll go to jail. You want me to go to jail? No, of course not. Haven't we always been in it together? Well, yeah, we're in this together too. Devon turned and looked at Kelsey and the blood on the floor. The red blood wasn't spreading as quickly, but they were still moving, crawling like an army of red soldiers across the linoleum. We can't possibly get him help fast enough. He's lost too much blood. If we try, we'll only get ourselves in trouble. Mick stared even harder at Devon. Are you even sorry this happened? Of course I am, Devon yelled. Mick held up his hands. Okay. He took a red breath. Okay. Devon realised he was shaking. He felt tremors in both of his legs. He had to concentrate to stay standing. He was a murderer. A chill skittered across his neck. He wasn't sure whether what he was feeling was because of what he'd done, or because he was afraid he was going to get in trouble for what he had done. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. Okay, this is what we're going to do. Mick rubbed his nose and looked up at Devon, as if Devon was going to make everything better. Devon would never be able to make anything better. We can't undo what happened, he said. We? Mick objected. You make it sound like I was a part of it. I wasn't part of it. Okay, me. I can't undo it. So from here, we have a choice. Either we tell, and I go to jail, or we don't tell, and I don't go to jail. Either way, Kelsey is the same. I wish I hadn't done it. I'm sorry. Very, very sorry. But that doesn't help Kelsey. Me going to jail doesn't help him either. You're saying we should leave him. Mick's voice was hushed. Devon took a deep breath and let it out. Yes, that's what I'm saying. For at least a minute, the boys stood there. Outside, a crow cawed. Another answered. Inside, the only sounds were those of Devon and Mick's open-mouthed breathing. Both were stuffed up from crying. The uneven and quick huffing sounds they were making were eerie. But not as eerie as that dry, scuttling sound. What was that? Devon grabbed Mick's arm. Come on, where did you leave your backpack? Mick pointed. It was against the wall near the entrance, right next to Devon's backpack. Devon made himself turn around and look for his flashlight. It was lying next to a stack of bins Mick had dragged out of the storage room. Making a wide arc well away from the bear suit and the blood, Devon strode across the room and got his flashlight. Did you leave anything else? He tried to ignore the fact that the scuttling sound was coming from the bear suit. Mick, whose eyes looked glazed, blinked and looked around. I don't think so. Devon willed his legs to function right. He still felt like he was shaking all over and he was still having trouble breathing, but he had to get them out of here. Shoving his flashlight into his backpack, he grabbed Mick by the arm. Come on. Devon slipped through the sidelight and yanked Mick through behind him. Mick grunted, but he didn't complain. Once they'd crawled out into the late afternoon sunshine, though, Mick spoke up. What about Kelsey's backpack? Devon looked back at the building. Should he go get it? And do what with it? No one was going to come out of here. And if they did, and went in, they'd find Kelsey. Wouldn't they? So, what did it matter if his backpack was there too? Devon looked at Mick, who was looking around at the woods as if he was trying to figure out what they were. Devon grabbed his arm. Come on. Devon was afraid to go to sleep that night. He thought they'd have nightmares. But he didn't. He was so tired at the end of the day that sleep was like a black void, and the black void was his friend. Not only was it like a blanket of blissful nothingness that wiped out the events of the day, it had a lingering effect the next morning. It acted sort of like the one of the sheer curtains his mum had hung in their kitchen. You could still see through it, but it obscured the details. Tuesday morning, Devon knew what he'd done the day before. He remembered everything, but it was just murky enough to feel unreal, as if he'd watched it on a scary movie instead of living it. Before he and Mick had split up to head home the previous afternoon, Devon had said to Mick, "In it together." Mick had repeated the words flatly, like a robot running on low power. That had worried Devon before he went to bed last night. This morning, he wasn't concerned. Mick would be quiet. And Mick was, in fact, quiet. Too quiet. One of the things that Devon had been able to count on for the previous 10 years was that his school days would start with Mick chattering. Today, though, Mick wasn't chattering. The boys were now settling in against the stone wall where they liked to eat lunch outside, and Mick hadn't said more than, "Hey Dev," since Devon had met up with him to walk to school. Devon was still in a twilight-like state of denial, but the twilight was wearing off. When Mrs. Patterson had noticed Kelsey's absence from class, the filmy barrier between Devon and what he'd done tore a little bit. The details were coming back. Mick opened his lunch sack with none of his usual enthusiasm. Devon tried to animate his friend. "What did you get today?" Mick's mum always put in at least one treat in Mick's lunch. "Huh?" Mick sniffed. "Oh, I don't know." Devon sighed. Mick set down his sack and leaned toward Devon. He whispered, "I can't stop thinking about him." "Shh," Devon hissed. "Not here." Mick's eyes moistened and his face turned red. Devon glanced around and then patted Mick's hand. "It's okay. We'll talk about it this afternoon, okay? We'll go to our camp." He hoped the words "our camp" would soothe Mick. Mick liked it when Devon called their makeshift, tarp-covered temporary meeting place our camp. Mick wiped his eyes. "Okay." But he said it so quietly, Devon could barely hear him. Settled cross-legged on the cool but dry forest floor, Mick played with a pile of tiny fir cones. Devon watched him, waiting for his friend to speak. He waited for several minutes. Finally, Mick said, "What if he's still alive?" He glanced up from his fir cone art, then looked back down. "That's what I can't stop thinking about. What if he's still alive?" Devon didn't respond. He thought about that, too, but he sure was trying not to. "I almost puked when they called his name in class," Mick said. Devon could relate, but he didn't say so. Instead he said, "I don't think he's still alive." Mick raised his head and blinked at Devon. "But you're not sure?" Devon shook his head. He could almost hear the ripping sound as the flimsy barrier protecting him from the previous day tore open a little more. He screwed his eyes shut, as if that would help. "No, I'm not sure." Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. By Wednesday, panicked fear and mystery rippled through the school like consussive waves radiating outward from a ground zero event. It was all anyone was talking about. Where was Kelsey? The police had been called in. Mick stayed home from school sick for all 3 days. When Devon went to see him, Mick swore he wouldn't say anything to anyone, but Mick couldn't keep any food down. His mother thought he had a stomach flu. Devon handled the whole thing better than Mick. His years living outside the social groups of the school had given him the ability to keep his face neutral, no matter how he felt on the inside. He was about to go about his business nearly invisibly. He was sure he looked normal, even though he was nothing but. Every muscle in his body felt rigid. It hurt to move. But he couldn't be still either. By the end of the week, Devon had nearly chewed his nails off. On Friday afternoon, Mr. Wright announced to the school that the police concluded Kelsey had run away. Apparently, no one had seen Kelsey leave the school with Devon and Mick, and apparently Kelsey hadn't told anyone where he was going. Neither one of these things surprised Devon. As far as he knew, only he and Mick left the school the way they did. They were the only ones who ever cut through the railway yard, and of course Kelsey wouldn't tell anyone he was going someplace with Mick and Devon. You only had to be in the school a couple of days to know that it was a social suicide to hang out with Mick and Devon. Kelsey was smart enough to have figured that out. Devon was still surprised Kelsey had even apologised to them on Monday. He thought it would be much harder than it was to lure Kelsey to... Accidents happen. Devon visited Mick on Friday afternoon. Mick was eating a bowl of soup when Devon arrived. "He's keeping his food down," Mick's mum said, giving Devon a hug in the doorway of Mick's room. I doubt he's contagious or anything. Go on in. Thanks, Mrs. Callahan. Devon smiled at the round, red-headed, freckled woman. He felt like he had bugs crawling up his arms. It was her hug. He'd felt the same every time his mum had hugged him during the week. He didn't deserve hugs. Do you want any soup, dear? Mrs. Callahan asked. There's plenty. Devon shook his head. No thank you. Mrs. Callahan chucked him under the chin. You boys are growing up so fast. She bustled away. Devon plopped down in the red beanbag chair just inside the door of Mick and Debbie's room. Hey, he said to Mick. He glanced at the bright blue and yellow polka dot divider curtain. Mick, tucked under a red superhero blanket on his bed, propped up with pillows in matching cases, wiped his mouth. Hey. He looked like he was going to say something else, but then he went back to eating his soup from a huge orange bowl. Devon looked around the tiny half room. Unlike Devon's room, which was pretty bare, except for a few nature posters and a couple rock collections, Mick's room was packed full of toys. It didn't look like a 15-year-old's room, it looked like a kid's room. Mick's part of the room didn't have much furniture, just a bed, a nightstand, and some shelves with a drop-down desk built in. The shelves had books, but they were also crowded with superhero and sci-fi action figures and stacks of board games. Devon looked at the curtain again. Mick must have noticed. Debbie's staying over at a friend's house. Devon nodded. Mick dropped his spoon. It hit the bowl with a clatter. He wiped his mouth, and then said through the napkin he held against his face, What if he's still alive? Devon whipped around to be sure the door was still closed. She's in the kitchen, Mick said. Dad's not home. He shoved his tray away. I haven't told anyone, and I'm not going to. But I can't stop thinking about him. What if he's still alive? It's been 6 days. Yeah, but he's not alive. How could he be? But he could be. How? He couldn't move, and he doesn't have water.